This podcast provides a platform to discuss important questions and complex issues, challenge the status quo, and confront the boundaries of the establishment. I'm retired police chief Daniel Hahn. I went from being arrested at 16 to serving over 34 years in law enforcement. My goal is to keep you informed with news not being reported, voices not being heard, and the untold history of how we got here so that we can create a way forward. I have with my guest today, very honored to have Jesse Vasquez, who is the executive director of Friends of San Quentin News, which also encompasses all incarcerated run media programs. And you're also heavily involved in East Oakland at the Madison Park Academy. And we'll get into those in a minute. But maybe the place we start is, tell us a little bit about how you grew up and eventually how you became an incarcerated person.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I grew up in Southern California, pretty much a typical life, of middle class, lower class family. Every place we went to, we rented. We didn't own anything. We moved from place to place depending on, what the needs were. And my general crowd of company was folks that came from, similar backgrounds. I come from a mother who's an immigrant. My father is second generation, Mexican. And, for the most part, it was just a hardworking family. My mother was a stay-at-home mom, so we always had emotional presence. Unfortunately, I grew up in environments where there was a lot of gang influence, a lot of gang activity, a lot of gun violence and drug overdoses and things like that. So those were the realities of my neighborhood. And eventually it just took, me making some wrong decisions and falling into that same way of life. Just running the streets. I was a good student, I did great in school and stuff like that, but I also had like this desire to fit in, and just have some friends. Eventually those decisions led me to a life of crime, just selling drugs and getting involved in some shootouts and some shootings. And eventually I attempted to murder somebody, and ended up with a couple life sentences in the California Department of Corrections at the age of 17.
And how old were you when you very first, caught your first case or went into custody your very first time?
The first time was when I was 13 years old. I went in at 13 years old. I was, driving a car, ended up crashing, hit and run. And it was just one of those little joyride nights, that turned ugly. Mm-hmm. And ended up in juvenile hall. And then after that, I got comfortable, It wasn't like I was scared straight. I went to juvenile hall, and it was just like, okay, you're going to be here 3-4 months, and it's your first time. They let you out, and then it just became a revolving door for me.
Right. And so starting at 13, in and out and the last time you were released, how old were you?
The last time I was released, before I caught my life sentence?
No, when you got commuted.
Oh, when I got commuted? Yeah. So in 2018, Governor Jerry Brown commuted my sentence, and I was released May 22nd, 2019. So I was 36 years old.
So basically from 13 to 36, you were in and out of institution.
Correct.
So when you first caught I think you said 3 life sentences?
Yeah. What
was your thought process, and what was it like in the institution for you with that sentence? That seems like forever to me.
Oh, for sure. As a juvenile, it definitely felt like, oh, wow, like there's a long time, but it was like 25 to life for this, 25 to life for that, life for this. And it's like, is that all necessary? Like you go through that doubt, like, man, like, is it really that serious? And it was like, okay, I know that I had, shot somebody multiple times. So I was like, okay, I'm content with that. But, the persona that you put on it, it's like you have to take on like this role of like, oh, it ain't nothing. It ain't fazing me, right? But it wasn't so much like, okay, here's all the time that I have to do. It was like, here's everything that I've lost. So I went through that phase for like the first 5 years of my incarceration. I would brag about, like this, how much time I got. Because, for some of us, being a lifer was like a badge of honor.
Right.
Like, like dummies get 2 or 3 years at a time. We just catch life sentences, Ain't no reason to have no 3 strikes. I got mine on the first one.
Right.
So it was like a badge of honor that you can brag about. And even then, it was just because I was ignorant about like the human cost of incarceration. So the first 5 years, it was nothing but like grappling with like trying to be, this prison tough guy and trying to fit in, because going in at a young age, like you have to form your identity in there. Like I was never taught on the streets, right? Like how to be a man, what was expected of me, the responsibilities and all
Because you
that.
were 13.
Exactly, so all I learned was like how to be a toxic, individual, how to be, how to have this boss bravado, and how to, represent, where I'm coming from and who I am, and don't let anybody talk down to you and stuff like that, and rebel against all, authority figures. And it was like there was this struggle within me because I knew right from wrong from my parents. Like nobody had to tell me right from wrong, but at the same time, it's like I have to do wrong to fit in. Because
Right.
if you want to do right, then, you stand out and you become the black sheep, in the group. And then coming from my background, like California prisons are race and gang segregated, and it's hard, to like break away from what you've known.
Right.
So I just had to adapt to that culture, and even though I felt like I felt bad because on the streets when I was young, I had black friends, Asian friends, white friends going to prison, I couldn't associate with anybody for too long without it being seen as suspicious, because I stuck with my own crew and stuff. And it was hard because I realized later on, like towards the 10th year, it's like everybody else is growing in like mentally and emotionally, and they're having more friends in the prison community. And I'm still stuck in my own mindset, because I haven't grown out of it. I've grown like in age, and I've grown in terms of like my mental capacity, but I hadn't grown out of my own mentality.
Right.
So it was just like hard, finding my own identity as an individual, as a man, and especially as an incarcerated Hispanic.
That brings me to another question. I've heard you speak before where um, racial issues or racial division or beliefs about certain race, especially in prison, that's very racially segregated. Uh, Talk to us about what that meant for you then, and how, as you got older, that evolved to where you dealt with those issues.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to be outside of prison now and reflect on all of these things and be able to look back and say, man, like what the heck were we thinking? Like racism and race is an issue that's been prevalent in this country since its inception.
Absolutely.
So like now when I went into the prison system, it's like, okay, I came into the prison system not as a racist individual. I came into the prison system as somebody who was open-minded, but I have to adjust to like what the cultural norms are. So I come into a racist system, right?
Right.
That was segregated that way by law. It wasn't something that we created. So this is the thing, right? Like we may be gang segregated by choice, but we weren't race segregated by choice. We were race segregated from before I got to prison,
Right.
before anybody else got there, because that's how the prison systems were built. Whites were always segregated from everybody else. And if you was anything but white, you were segregated somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
So we were always kept that way. And eventually in the California prison system, it just became a structure of the cultural norms. So I adjusted to that system, even though I felt like, this isn't like the right way to do things because I've never been racist. But you buy into that agenda, and the more that you see the riots and the stabbings and, the differences in culture, it's like, yeah, you're trained to love your own culture, but you shouldn't be trained to hate somebody else's.
Right.
And that was one of the things that I could never like adjust to. That it's like, at the one hand, you don't want to associate with blacks, but that's all the music we listen to.
And how did
And
you get
if,
from that place to where you are now? Because, as somebody that's passionate about history, this is an issue that's been around, as you said, from the inception of this country. So how did you, as an individual, as yourself, transition from what was surrounding you at all times to accepting?
yeah, I think one of the biggest things was I realized, number one, that I had been ignorant to buy into a lot of the rhetoric. And I think my mental faculties increased, right? Like the day that I started thinking critically for myself and analyzing, like, why do I believe this bullshit? That's when I actually started seeing the world in a whole different way. It wasn't like something external for me, right? Like I had like friends in prison that were white supremacists, right? And it was okay. You can hate blacks, you can hate Mexicans. I don't care. You can think you're better than us. It doesn't matter. You ain't better than me, right? I can run
more on
faster
them
than you.
than
I
it
can
is
let's
on
see,
you.
right? It's like, man, that's more responsibility for you, bro. You know, like you have to prove yourself to be better than me. I don't, right?
Right.
You can hold that view, and I can still respect you. I can still love you. I can still associate with you, so long as it does not infringe upon my safety and security.
Deep, deep.
As long as you don't mess with me, I don't care what the heck you want to believe. That's your business. That's your right. You know, as an individual, you can hold that. Me, I don't want to hold no hatred towards nobody. I don't want to limit myself, right? And it wasn't until I got to like, because, you know, like I said before, like cultural norms and, you know, like social structures, they influence our behavior a lot. You know, a lot of people that I know in prison are there because of peer pressure, what they call it, right?
Right.
But it's like, yeah, it's like environmental and cultural things, right? So when I got moved from Old Folsom State Prison, right, which was still like heavily gang and race segregated, I went to San Quentin State Prison. San Quentin is completely integrated.
And why
Completely
did you?
integrated.
I think you wanted to move from
Oh
Folsom
yeah,
to San
for
Quentin.
sure.
Why was that?
For sure. It was the college program. Like I wanted to get a higher education. I wanted to participate in the programs. I had read the San Quentin News. And I had seen like these are the programs that we have at San Quentin. We have a full-fledged college program, you know, called Prison University Project. We have a newspaper. We have all these rehabilitative programs, and they would show pictures of people smiling and people hanging out and people playing baseball with
Seemed
free
unusual
people.
for prison.
Oh, for sure. I thought it was state propaganda. When I first seen it, I'm like, man, this is bullshit. This is state
Right,
propaganda.
right.
And all of a sudden, I was like, you know what? I got to go check it out. I want to go see this, right? Not because I was like ready for the full transformation of like, you know, being fully awakened, but I was open to the possibility because I saw something better than just segregation and fighting over, you know, a little concrete yard and a little phone and a shower and stuff, right? That I'm not going to get to keep.
Right.
So I decided, okay, let me go and experience this adventure. I got there and it was like life-changing because the whole culture, the whole dynamics were different, not only from the incarcerated perspective, but even from the corrections officers. Like we had free people that would come in from the streets, volunteers and stuff, shaking hands with you and telling you, hey, how you doing? How's everything going? Would you like to participate in this program and stuff? And it's like, everybody at the other prison, you don't get recruited for nothing.
Right.
Only time you see a free person is on a tour and you feel like you're in a zoo. All of a sudden, you know, you get to engage with these individuals and learn from them. And that started opening my mind to like a whole different world, a world that can actually be a community in spite of all the differences and all the class structures that we came from. Here you have like San Quentin is in the richest county in America, Marin County. Only 30% of the land is actually populated. It's the richest county, and you got these people coming in flocks and droves to volunteer and help from a different class and a different strata and a different race, wanting to come to help you in spite of what you've done.
And I
That's
think you've
life-changing.
even said that the correctional officers that were within the newsroom or whatever it was called basically treated you different than the other parts of where you had been. Is that?
Yeah, it's I think it's a cultural thing, right? Like I've spoken to many officers. I still have some correction officers that are still friends to this day since I've been out.
Since you've been out.
Since I've
I
been
think
out.
people would be surprised about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've been fortunate enough, right, to go to baseball games with the warden, the associate warden, and a couple of facility lieutenants.
I think some
And
people in society say you're supposed to hate that warden.
it's not his fault I was in prison, though. Why would I hate somebody for being in prison? Like, it's not their fault, you know? Like, they're entrusted with making sure that the institution runs. It's not their fault that I made bad choices and put myself in that predicament. Now, it's their responsibility to make sure that I have access and equal rights to all the opportunities that are available at their facility under their watch. That is their responsibility, you know, but we have mechanisms to hold them accountable for that. But it's not their responsibility, you know, for my feelings and my bad choices as a juvenile. You know, so I don't hold no like hate or anger or frustration or bitterness towards the officers who arrested me, the prosecutors who sent me, the judge who sentenced me, or the guards that were in charge of like making sure that I obeyed by the rules and stuff while I was incarcerated. That's not my story.
Right.
That's not my opinion. You know, I was fortunate enough to make it to San Quentin, which is unique in probably the whole country. It's definitely unique in California. It's one of the most rehabilitative prisons in America.
And let's dig into that a little bit. I'm curious what you think is the difference between that environment where you were talking about the people from outside the institution that come in to help, the correctional officers that work in that environment versus some of the other environments in the institutions. Not too long ago, I went on a tour of the prison industries at Old Folsom, and they have a whole section, one of the largest, most successful Braille, where they write books for people who are blind in the country.
Right.
And the correctional officer that's one of it where he works started crying when he was talking to us about the inmates that were in there working. And I never seen a correctional officer cry about talking about the work that the folks that are incarcerated do in there. And you've kind of described similar in San Quentin. What do you think it is about that environment that seems a little different than some of the other environments in the institutions?
Yeah, I think having been in, about a dozen institutions, I got a good understanding of what, some of those factors may be.
Right.
I'm not just speaking out of theory as most people do in these types of situations. All the other institutions are very restrictive. Program is limited, community involvement is, limited, it's scarce. So there's a couple of factors there, right? Number one, imagine the element of human proximity. At San Quentin, you have volunteers coming in all day, every day.
So it's kind of segregated from the rest of the world, basically.
Exactly.
Okay.
So you have like a unique environment where all these community volunteers come in, right? So that works two things, right? Number one, it works for pro-social development for the incarcerated, where they can learn to develop as human beings and talk to other people as individuals versus, that's a cop and I'm an inmate, or I'm an incarcerated person and that's a guard, right? Now you start seeing people as like, oh, just people. Versus other institutions, all you see constantly is the guards in green and the guys in blue. So that's all you see, and that's the mindset of us against them. The other factor that plays a good role in like all these community engagement and volunteers is the accountability aspect. See, guards are less likely to be assholes when there's community presence because there's eyeballs watching. So for us in blue, if you write a complaint or a 602.
And us in blue, you're talking about the people that are incarcerated.
The people that are incarcerated, right? So all of a sudden, right? So it's our word against theirs. How many times do you think they're going to believe the incarcerated over a guard?
Probably not often.
Exactly. So all of a sudden, you got all these community volunteers coming in. You can't really assault too many people if you got a lot of community eyeballs on you. You can't really do too much,
Right.
So it kind of curbs that desire, right, to lash out and be unprofessional. Because granted, a lot of times, right, that I saw in other institutions where things got out of hand and there was riots with the officers and, somebody ended up getting beat up, it was because of unprofessionalism. It was just that.
Right.
Simple as that. It wasn't like, you know what, I don't like you today and I want to beat you up. It wasn't like us against them and, we have to beat them up every
Losing
single
your
day of their
dignity.
life.
Yeah.
It's like, no, it was always behind a corrections officer disrespecting the wrong person on the wrong day, deviating from his professionalism, right? And thinking that, you know what, he's protected because of his uniform, and it don't work like that for some folks.
Right. So you mentioned a minute ago that when you went to Quentin, you took college courses and got involved with this program at San Quentin. But I want to go back to the college courses. Over the years, even from when I was in high school and fresh out of high school at the junior college, I would hear a lot of people upset that they had college programs in prison. And even to this day, you can hear people saying, look, I have to pay for college, and I haven't done anything wrong. How do you give these cats in prison a college education that me on the outside, who hasn't done anything wrong or got caught for anything wrong, has to pay for things? So you are a beneficiary of those programs. What would your response be to the people that think that, you just need to be in there busting rocks or something and doing hard time, and we shouldn't be having that sort of investment into you?
Yeah, I think number one, it's important to value people's opinion and recognize where they're coming from. You know, like my first thing is I would want to understand, why do you make those statements? You know, apart from the economic thing, right?
Right.
Like I have to pay for these courses. Like I don't think people understand that even though the incarcerated aren't paying for those courses, somebody's paying for it. Somebody's paying for it, and it's usually a foundation, a government, you know, some high net wealth donor who wants to make sure that, hey, these folks have a second chance at life, have an opportunity, right? So somebody does pay for it, and it's usually not coming out of like the community pocket, right? But, you know, for those individuals who do say that, it's like, okay, well, you could take advantage of the same thing if you go to prison. You could get it for free. That's number one, right? You have the option. You have the option, right? You could come and follow us, right, and take that path, come out with a college degree, or you could seek some scholarships, some sponsorships, right? It all depends, right, what path you want to take, because there are like financial assistance for everybody. It's not like you couldn't get the help and you couldn't get the free college if you actually wanted it for free. Somebody could sponsor you. You could get a scholarship, you know, you could find some way, some mechanism. It's easy to complain about people that are disenfranchised, historically marginalized, right? And who don't have a voice or a platform to defend themselves. You know, it's easy to always point the finger, and the reason why I didn't go to college is because all the money went to them. And it's like, no, it's because you're lazy, probably. You know, there are other reasons why you did not go to college. It isn't just that. There are plenty of colleges, I will tell you, most of the community college courses that are offered through correspondence inside of prison, the quality of education is not at par with what you would get. I was disappointed when I found out that the two AAs that I had from a certain college that I will not name, they weren't even accredited fully because some of the courses weren't even recognized. And you know why that is? So this is an interesting thing for those who think that it's all about funding. Sometimes it is. So a lot of community colleges that don't reach the benchmark in enrollment for funding have to rely on correspondence colleges to the incarcerated to make up the difference to get federal funding. So it's not our fault that they want to give us free courses. It's to their advantage, not ours. You know, they're not doing us a favor. They're doing themselves a favor. We get the benefit from it too, though. So we'll take on whatever handout we can get to improve our lives and our quality of life. We'll take it. But it's not always just on us. You know, they always want to blame the incarcerated because we low-hanging fruit. We're low-hanging fruit for politicians. We low-hanging fruit for police funding. We low-hanging fruit for these folks that want to make an excuse for why they can't succeed in life. We low-hanging fruit for everybody. But guess what? We're not. You know, we have just as much a right to the opportunities that exist in this country to help bring people up so that we can have some sense of equity.
Well, on one of our other shows, somebody that had done time in prison said, basically, we're human beings too, right? We did things wrong, but we're still human beings. So with that, I think, as you've said, it sounds like San Quentin and the programs at San Quentin, the media programs, the writing programs at San Quentin, were and are a big part of your life and a big part of your evolution to where you are now. Talk to us a little bit about the history of that program that you're a part of in San Quentin, because I know it started out just at San Quentin. Now I think it's expanded to numerous other prisons with a much larger distribution. So just talk to us about that and what it meant to you to get to where you're at now.
Yeah, for sure. So San Quentin News, it's a publication that started surprisingly by a warden, prison warden. You know, back in 1940, Clinton T. Duffy decided that, you know what, the incarcerated should have a publication so that, number one, they can quell the rumors that are happening in institutions. Number two, they can report about things that impact them and that are important to them. And number three, they need to have a voice. They need to have some say. So that was surprising that a prison warden would start the publication for the incarcerated,
Yeah.
you know? So that's like, you know, historical for me, right? And the prison newspaper was shut down back in like 1984, you know, over some lawsuit. It was resurrected by a prison warden again. Robert Ayers Jr. in 2008 said, you know what, I want to bring this newspaper back. I think it can make a difference in the culture of the institution. I think it can make a difference in the mindset of the individuals. And we want them to have a voice, you know, so that they can actually have something to say and also report on things that are important to them in the community. And then, you know, we only printed 4,000 copies inside of San Quentin at that
It
time.
just went inside.
Exactly. So then Another warden in 2012, Mr. Ron Davis, who's in Sacramento now, somewhere in headquarters, he said, you know what? If you guys wanted this paper, what would you do with it? Like, what's your ideal vision
When
for
he
this
says
newspaper?
you guys, he's talking about the guys in blue.
Yeah, the news staff.
Yeah,
The
okay.
incarcerated staff. What would you guys want to do with this paper, right? And the guys were like, we want to be in every institution in California. And at that time, there was 36 institutions. And the warden said, you know what? I'm going to make that happen. So he went to a warden's meeting, and he convinced all the wardens to go ahead and accept the newspaper. So all of a sudden,
I would say that's part of humanizing people, right? You ask their opinion.
Yeah, exactly. So he was like, we've had these progressive wardens, who have taken on not just the challenge of overseeing, the carceral system, but also have not risen up to the opportunity of like, how can we improve what we're doing for these individuals incarcerated? So we went from printing 4,000 copies inside of San Quentin to printing over 35,000 copies and distributing them to all the prisons in California. And then within the next couple of years, we had the Reva and David Logan Foundation and the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation come in and make a significant contribution to help expand the reach of the publication, because it ain't free to print. It costs about 10 grand a month, to print and distribute this newspaper. So Richard Logan from the Reva and David Logan Foundation and Jonathan Logan visited the newsroom, and they said, you know what? We think everybody should be able to hear these voices, and we want to make sure that it's perpetuated and it continues. So that's how we went from printing just 4,000 to printing, right now we're at 40,000 copies. We're in all 35 institutions, juvenile halls, county jails. We distribute to individuals outside of California in 48 different states now. And then as far as our training program goes, when I transferred to San Quentin, I got recruited to be a part of the Journalism Guild, which is our writing program on how to become a journalist, how to learn objectivity, and be a concise writer. So we're in 3 different institutions now with that program. We have
training inmates how to
exactly.
do that.
We're training other incarcerated individuals.
Incarcerated.
Exactly. Now you got to remember, you ain't police chief no more. You got to start talking about incarcerated people.
Got it.
So, so we're training men and women, on the craft of journalism, storytelling, and our ultimate goal, right, is to have at least one media center in every state across the country, at least in the states that have high incarceration rates of predominantly Black and brown communities. Number one, because we believe that it's important for the incarcerated to get their voice out into mainstream media, to have a say. And number two, because we believe that it's a primary tool of democracy. You can't exclude people in the community and think that you have a community when you marginalize 2.7 million across the nation, and 150,000 in California alone. Just because they're in prison doesn't mean they don't have a voice and they shouldn't have a vote.
Right. What did this program, you're still heavily involved in this program now that you're not incarcerated, but how did this, what impact did this program have on you?
I think one of the things of being in prison is I never thought I was going to get out. And all I saw was what was in my institution, what was in my vicinity, right? I didn't care about watching the news. I didn't care about what happened on the streets, what gas prices were looking like. I didn't worry about none of that, because when you have multiple life sentences and no hope of getting out, the only life you have is what's inside. And you can't ever see anything, beyond that, because when I went into the system, no life was coming home.
And what's harmful about that?
There's a lot of harm in giving human beings no hope. You have them in a sense of despair, and then you wonder why they have to self-medicate, why they lash out, why they're always bitter, angry, grumpy. And it goes back to like the days of Governor, Gray Davis, when he made a statement talking about no lifers coming out of prison unless it's in a pine box. What kind of hope you think that gives anybody with a life sentence?
Exactly.
None. So all of a sudden, you got like Jerry Brown comes back into office, after 35 years of, being somewhere else, right? He comes
Including
back.
Oakland.
Exactly. He comes back, and all of a sudden it's like, hey, you know what? I think we need to reform this system. I think we need to change it. you know, and we went from being in despair and darkness, right, to all of a sudden having a sense of hope, you know, where it was like, now I have an incentive, right? Like there's a glimmer and a chance that I might get out. For me, it was like, okay, I may never get out, but it's okay. I have opportunity to do good. There's a chance for me to grow and be better, right? And leave a better legacy. There's a way that I can mentor younger incarcerated individuals. There was programs that I started in the California prison system, right? That had it not been for me, they wouldn't have a literacy program for ESL. Because when they cut the funding under Arnold Schwarzenegger for the education programs, they didn't want anybody learning English. And it's like, you got like 26% of the population in California who are just Spanish speakers. You know, almost 40% are Hispanic, 26% of those, right, only speak Spanish. Why would you not teach them English? How are they supposed to appeal? How are they supposed to participate? How are they supposed to rehabilitate? Exactly, exactly. But I don't want to believe that the system is sinister, right, and that it's set up for failure, right, and that they want to keep us locked down, right? But when you see those type of like cuts, those budget cuts that affect, you know, your quality of life and your opportunity for personal growth, right? You can't help but think that, yeah, there's a conspiracy about keeping Black and brown people incarcerated or at least in ignorance.
Or it might just be the comfortable thing to do because that's what you've always done. So you mentioned Governor Brown and you mentioned Governor Davis. And you talked earlier about how your sentence was commuted, and that's why you're sitting here with us today. So again, to the people that would agree with Governor Davis and say, hey, you got to do your whole time. Especially today, I hear a lot with violent crime increasing in many cities across the country. I hear a lot of people going, the reason for that is we just letting everybody out. So those people would probably be more in line with Governor Davis that says, you know, you're going to do your whole sentence, as opposed to Governor Brown, who commuted your sentence. What would you say, one, in general, you kind of mentioned it, what it means to have hope and have programs that can build you towards that hope, that you can get out and live a healthy, productive life outside, versus the people that say you should just stay in prison?
Yeah, I think it's a valid point. It's a valid point, you know, especially when you just look at the statutes, right? If you look at the law as a statute and you say, okay, you know, this costs 50 cents, you got to pay 50 cents. You know, if you say, okay, this crime is, you know, it's going to cost you 25 years of your life, right? If it's going to cost you 15, 10 years, whatever, right? But the laws aren't set that way. The laws are arbitrary. See, if we had a fair criminal justice system and we had fairness as, you know, the standard by which we're going to say, okay, you know, this is the standard that you're going to like gauge every life on, I'm going to tell you the truth. And I'm going to tell you why I'm biased, right? I know a white gentleman who killed 2 people was out in 7 years. Because somehow, some way, you know, it was seen as manslaughter versus murder. And I've seen Black and brown people, you know, for attempted murders with 2, 3 life sentences. There is no fairness in the criminal just is system. It's not justice. It just is the way it is because of politics.
And there's many stories like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So for me, you know, number one, like I recognize that there's a lot of survivors and victims groups out there, right? And they have a valid point to be angry, to be frustrated, and to want a semblance of justice. But first, let's define what justice is. We haven't even got to that point yet.
Right.
Because we're still dealing in anger and emotion.
Yep.
We haven't even had the conversation of what's fair. What does that actually look like? And what do the victims actually want? What do the majority of survivors want? Sometimes they just want closure. Sometimes they just say, you know what, I don't care what happens to him, you know, as long as he changes and he becomes better and my brother or sister or father didn't die in vain, you know, I'm good with that. So we can't just keep taking like, you know, one organization's voice and amplifying that and saying that everybody has that same opinion. That's one of the mistakes that we make. Number 2, right, when it comes to, you know, governors and politicians that want to be progressive and compassionate, right, I think it's their personal growth. Because Jerry Brown wasn't always as woke or as compassionate. Because if my, recollection, serves me right, I wasn't born when a lot of the, habitual criminal acts were put into place in California. But I believe that Jerry Brown was, the one behind those. And he came back to fix those 35 years later. But he came back with a different mindset after watching the system deteriorate and watching human beings, pine for some relief and some redemption, right? Because there was no hope for it. So I'd be hard pressed, and anybody would be hard pressed to find anybody who's had their sins commuted, who understands grace, right? Because a commutation is something we don't deserve. We just get it because the governor says, you know what? I think you've done enough time. I think you could be a good contributor to our community. I think you'd be an asset, right? The attorneys weigh in, the parole board weighs in, and they let you out. Those individuals, they have a 0% recidivism. You couldn't find one person who has been commuted. You'd see it all over the news if they did.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
All of the new crimes and all of these violent crimes, I hate to break it to some of these folks that think it's because we're being lenient on crimes. All of these are new criminals. They ain't the old ones doing these new crimes. The old ones already learned their lesson, So sometimes people just got to do some fact checking. That's the one thing that I am very appreciative about journalism. I learned how to fact check. I do not open my mouth unless I am sure about something. Because if some of these people who spew these numbers and all this hate and rhetoric, if they were in danger of being sued for defamation, they would not say some of this nonsense that they spew.
Absolutely.
Because they would be held accountable. But they get away with it because, of this fear-mongering. That's an interesting story, too. I'm pretty sure you remember, the Willie Horton case.
Oh, yeah.
Back in 1989.
Yep.
And this whole media frenzy that created that, right? They call it the Willie Horton effect, right? When they amplify so much one crime, right? And say oh, this is happening everywhere,
yes.
And they make people believe this, and then they force them, right? Or they manipulate them into fear.
Yep.
And
Happens
people
every day.
respond in fear all the time. And it's that's not happening every day. It not only happens with criminals, it happens also with cops.
Oh, yeah.
You have, a couple cops, who do something dumb, kill somebody, right? And it's maybe it was intentional, maybe it wasn't. It's not for me to judge. Whatever happened in that instant happened there. It's not every day across America
Right.
that
With
it's
every
happening.
cop.
With every cop,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
But
yeah.
that's what you hear.
Well, speaking of that, what does it say? Because we live in a fairly divisive environment right now.
Mm-hmm.
And what does it say about, you mentioned earlier you've been to, I think it was a baseball games, and you have a relationship with lieutenants, wardens, law enforcement officials. What does it say about you and about a warden that somebody with 3 life terms and a warden can go to a baseball game and have a relationship outside of the institution? What does that say about the two of you?
I think, having reflected on it in the baseball stands, right? With the pitchers, right? And, we even took a selfie because we thought, man, this is a historical moment for us, right?
I would say so.
And I remember he said, well, it's not how I thought, life would be. And we started laughing at it, right? Because I don't think any of us ever thought that. When he started his career 25 years ago, right, and I started my prison sentence, we were 2 totally different individuals. But here we are, 24, 25 years later, right, having gone through, this purging of stupidity, bias, prejudice, and having seen, the potential of every human being, and also, the potential for good and the potential for evil. Because I'm pretty sure as a warden, he saw many crooked cops. He saw a lot of misbehavior, a lot of misconduct, and a lot of investigations. And I, too, saw a lot of, making excuses and trying to blame somebody else, right? There's always this blame about the mysterious white man, right, who never shows up in court cases, right? But somehow he was behind it, right? But I think that the main reason why we were both able to, and we're still able to have this relationship is because we see value in the individual. Aristotle, as a philosopher, he says that there are 3 types of friends in the world that you're going to have. Number 1 is a friend of convenience, who only needs you for convenience. Number 2 is a friend of necessity. And number 3 is the friend of mutual admiration. You admire the individual because of his character, his intelligence, his integrity. And I think that's what we found in each other. That's the only kind of friends I got.
I think I'm sure you do this every day, shattering stereotypes and all sorts of beliefs that society puts in us. You know, somebody with 3 life sentences quoting Aristotle, I don't think most people are going to think that they would hear that. Along those same lines of the divisive environment that we live in, you know, I grew up in the neighborhood here in Sacramento. I was arrested at 16, but, you know, was only held for several hours. So I never actually did any time. And I witnessed all sorts of things in my neighborhood. And then I became police chief in a 34-year career. And what I've seen, especially over the last couple of years, but to be honest, my whole life, but really intense the last couple of years, is this division between community, especially the impoverished community and the minority community, and law enforcement. And I hear a lot outside of the impoverished community and outside of the minority community about abolition, to abolish law enforcement and start over with something completely new. As somebody that grew up in the neighborhoods, did a significant amount of time in custody, and now is doing amazing things, I'm curious what you think about law enforcement's presence in these communities and those that believe we should be doing away with law enforcement.
Yeah, that's it's interesting because in deep East Oakland, so I still live in the hood. You know, I probably couldn't afford to live anywhere but the hood, you know, especially in the Bay Area. Oakland is expensive, you know.
Can't even afford to live in the hood in the Bay Area.
Yeah, but you know, I love living in the neighborhood. I love living in the neighborhood. I don't like too much the cars that are sitting on bricks and stuff without tires and rims and all the shattered glass and windows and stuff, right? But it's home. It's home. It's what I remember. Mm-hmm. You know, it's what I remember growing up in, you know, Santa Ana in the neighborhoods. It's what I remember growing up in South Central Los Angeles. You know, it's what I remember on Rosecrans and in Compton and all the streets where I lived at. And there's some historical background behind all those neighborhoods, right? Like
Absolutely.
all of our families and all of our, you know, ancestors, right? They went through something. They came to something. They paved the way for us to have a better life, right? We made our choices, right? So when I go to my neighborhood in East Oakland and I volunteer there, I live there, I sleep there, I ride my bike around there, I feel safe there. I see police cars and stuff like that, and I'm like, what the hell are they up to, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not because I say that in a derogatory sense. It's like, who the hell is doing something dumb again, right? To like draw more attention and stuff, right? I've always known police, right? And granted, I also like lived in the Rampart district in Los Angeles. And that was a totally different type of, you know, police environment. There's movies and books written about them dudes, right?
Still.
Mayhem, right? But I wasn't like, I understand the terror that came behind that, but I also recognize like, hey, this was one generation during the time, and now they have to be held accountable. Now when I see like OPD, I've read the history, I've read the books, I know the history of Oakland fairly well. I love Oakland because of that. But one thing that I disagree with a lot of people that supposedly speak on behalf of our community, right? It's not everybody believes that we shouldn't have law enforcement. Not everybody believes that we should defund the police. They say that stuff sometimes, right? You know, I got neighbors who say, you know, even though like every time their catalytic converter gets stolen, first people they call is the cops. And it's like, why'd you call them? You know, I thought you talking about defund the police. Oh, I got to make a police report for the insurance. I'm just going through the formalities and stuff, right?
Right.
But when nobody's listening, nobody's watching, they tell me like, dude, the reason why I don't want to say anything, right, that I'm for law enforcement is because people are making it about race. That if you support law enforcement and, you know, institutions of oppression, that you're supporting state violence, white supremacy, and, you know, like the fundamentals of this country and stuff, right? And I think there's a huge difference between like me wanting to be safe in my community and having some safeguards, because nobody wants to see me take justice into my hands. It already cost me a couple, you know, decades of incarceration, you know, like thinking that I was doing some justice in my neighborhood. You know, so I don't think we want to see that in our communities. I'm not against law enforcement. I think it could be done better.
Right.
I think there's a way that we can like bridge the gap between like who polices our communities, you know, versus like who actually lives in them. Because sometimes you don't see officers that look like you know, in your neighborhood. And sometimes like some of the, I mean, I've seen some bad scenarios, right? Where it's like it could have turned ugly, but, you know, because of cell phone cameras and body cams, right? Like things were de-escalated really fast, right? And I wonder, like, if we didn't have that, would it have gone sideways, you know, for the individual? And I think that's what the community is like, you know, wanting to do versus like, it's not defund, but like, how can we fix it? You
Right.
know, because there's a necessity. There are certain, like, I always use the term necessary evils. In an ideal world, right? Me and you can walk down the street and nobody will judge us, nobody will say nothing, nobody will criticize us, right? Nobody will try to rob us, you know, try to take our cars or anything. That's an ideal world where we don't have people who have greed, envy, jealousy, right? Or a need,
Right.
you know,
When you don't have human emotion.
exactly. When you don't have that in place, it's like, okay, you know, we'd be cool.
Right.
But we don't have that. So, absent an ideal society, you have to have necessary evils. You have to have necessary structures and systems, right? And I would, you know, also, you know, just chime in, right? A plug for my folks in Central America, Mexico, and South America, right? Where it's street justice every day, where there ain't no law enforcement,
Right.
where you do a crime, ain't no doing no time. Somebody gonna whoop you in the middle of the street and probably hang you or beat you to death. Like that's how they do it. Every time you see Hispanic news, anytime you see the Spanish news, right? Whether it's Al Rojo Vivo, Univision or something, in Colombia, Peru, wherever you think of, right, that there's not a strong law enforcement presence, the community has to take matters into their own hands. And I think we take that for granted because in this first world country,
Sure.
we complain about everything. We have the luxury of sitting back and criticizing and complaining.
So one more question, then we'll wrap up. And I have the last thing I'm going to ask you is how can people help if they want to get involved? But ideally, you currently came from San Quentin and were part of that media program, the newspaper in San Quentin. Now you're outside, still working on those programs. Ideally for you, realistically, ideally, what would that look like as people are in custody and are coming out of custody? Is there more that could be done in regards to these programs that you run that could connect outside with inside and help ensure more people are successful on the outside after coming out of that environment for so many years?
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the things that, you know, we're seeing a lot of today, right, when people come home is there's a little bit more opportunity. The California Department of Corrections, at least in California, I can say, right, they have a lot more resources that they're willing to funnel into programs and projects, right, whether it's transitional housing, vocational training, or transitional thing. The one thing that we don't have that we do need more of is community integration. And what I mean by that is like communities opening up their arms and saying, you know what, like you don't have to just go to that state funded program. You can come to this program that's in the community. You can come into this home that's in our community. And also like local businesses, you know, opening up the doors to hiring formerly incarcerated. For us, it's like we have individuals that know how to manage a budget, know how to run Excel spreadsheets, you know, do mailings,
That they
mass
learn
mailings. Yeah,
while they're
they've learned
incarcerated.
everything. They learn how to
Yeah.
lay out a paper, a magazine, shoot video, do photography, right? They know how to edit and splice all this content together. They know how to do audio engineering, you know, video productions and stuff like that. And guess what? Ain't no pathways to employment in that industry. There's no pathways to employment, right? Not because we haven't tried cultivating them, right? But because, you know, in the mainstream media,
Stigma.
there's a lot of stigma. And that's one of the reasons why, like, we're going through rebranding right now with Friends of San Quentin News. And, you know, this new initiative, it's called Pollen Initiative. And the reason why we settled on the name pollen is because pollen as a seed, you know, it's inanimate. It needs help to be transported somewhere else. But it, surprisingly, it only grows inside of the part of the female plant called the stigma. That's the only place
I
where it
never knew that.
germinates.
Wow.
That's where the seed actually germinates and gives life to something completely new. So we want to make sure that these opportunities that we're presenting to the incarcerated not only germinate for them a new life, right, and a second chance, but also give hope to a broader, community that they're going to come home to one day.
That's awesome. I'd never known that, never heard that before. So with that in mind, somebody that's listening or hears about you or the program, how could they get involved? How could they help with this? How would they contact you? All of that. How would somebody help? Because one of the things that seems pretty evident to me is the vast majority of people that are incarcerated are going to come back at some point. And do we want them to come back as productive, healthy members of our community? Or I remember as a young officer, it was very prevalent in the mindset and the culture that, you're going to arrest this person, they're going to go to prison, and then they're going to get out, and they're going to commit a crime again, and we'll be there. We'll be there to catch them, and we'll be there to send them back to prison. Now, I had some different experiences because where I grew up, but still, that was the prevalent mindset, even for me.
Right.
Until I got a little bit older, and I thought to myself, every time you do that, there's a victim associated with that. So if I'm okay with them committing another crime because I'm just going to be there and arrest them, there's another family, another person in some way or shape is a victim of that, not including the person that committed the crime. Now they're, going back. So the vast majority of people are going to come back to our communities, and they're going to be driving and living and participating in our communities. And to me, it's as a society, how do we value and humanize, keep looking at somebody as human, but for our own self-preservation and our own well-being, I want this person to be as healthy as possibly can be because they're going to be my neighbor. So how could people help you with that goal of expanding those opportunities that you talked about? Where would they go? How would they contact you?
Yeah, so we do have a couple websites. The one that they can reach me at is friendsofsanquentinnews.org or .com. And then we have sanquentinnews.com and also forwardthisproductions.com. They can reach out through any of those platforms. Eventually, I will get the emails. Some of the things that we do need, is always volunteers. Okay. We always need mentors. We always need advisors. We could always use donors. We can always use sponsors. And we could definitely use community support in creating pathways for people coming home for employment. If they need somebody who's a good writer, whether it's a grant writer, story writer, somebody who can do some multimedia productions with them, even if they just want to hire an intern, we have people that are coming home that are willing and able, and, second chances. That's it. The community can do the best work that they do by giving us a second chance and a helping hand.
That's awesome. And I'm honored to meet you. It's I think a lot of times when I look around, I see people not fully using all their abilities and capabilities and heart and all that. And you definitely are somebody that does that and is an example for all sorts of people, but for our community of what's possible. What's possible when we look at somebody as a human being, what's possible when we give second chances. If whoever's out there that's never made a mistake or done something wrong, please stand up, because I don't think anybody would be standing up. So it's an honor to have met you and have you on the show. I appreciate you sharing with us, and all the luck and success to you and all the programs and the people, more importantly, that you help. Thank you for being on.
Thank you.
One of the big purposes of A Way Forward is to hear different voices and different opinions, because that is how we can make informed decisions ourselves. So if you are someone that would like to come on A Way Forward to express your opinion, go to chiefhahn.com/podcast. Chief, HAHN.com/podcast.